Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. If you read often enough, once in a while you'll probably come across a book that really challenges your way of thinking, giving you new insights into something you thought that you previously fully understood. For me, one of those books is Ultra Processed People by Chris Van Tulleken. He's an infectious diseases doctor and associate professor at University College London, and he's also done some work with the BBC. The book delves into the alarming rise of ultra-processed foods in our modern diet and their significant impact on our health and well-being. Having spent years trying to eat healthier through calorie counting and struggling to cut out things like chocolate and sweets, this book gave me a complete paradigm shift in not only how I approach what I eat, but also, and I think crucially, in helping me understand how the food industry manipulates us. It's a truly eye-opening read. So in this video, I'm going to explore 4 different points that the book touches on. The first is what are ultra-processed foods, or UPF. The second is why they're bad for us. Third, I'm going to look at the history of ultra-processed foods and how the food industry preys on us. And finally, I'm going to look for solutions to the UPF problem. So let's get into it. So what is UPF? There are many definitions, but according to the author, a really good way to think about it is this. If it comes wrapped in plastic and has at least one ingredient that you wouldn't use in home cooking, then it's probably UPF. These would include preservatives, emulsifiers, sweeteners, artificial colours and flavours and things like that. Another way to look at it is to consider the NOVA food classification system that was developed by a team of nutrition researchers in Sao Paulo in Brazil. So in this system there are 4 classifications: raw unprocessed foods, processed culinary ingredients, processed foods, and finally ultra-processed foods, which would include things like soft drinks, most chocolate, frozen pizzas, ready meals, most breads, most sweets, a lot of cheeses, things like that. That final category, UPF, now makes up as much as 60% of the average diet in the UK and the US. On one level, that's quite shocking, but on another level, I don't think it is, because UPF is absolutely everywhere. Every time you enter a shop, you see UPF. Every time you open your phone or turn on your TV, you're bombarded with UPF ads. Think back on all the food that you've eaten in the last 24 hours. And I think unless you actively make an effort to avoid processed foods already, I guarantee you will have eaten some form of UPF. In fact, our reliance on UPF is so central to our Western diets that Tulleken argues that we've entered a new age of eating beyond the time that lasted millions of years, when humans got most of their nutrients from minimally processed foods. And this leads us to one of the central arguments of the book, that ultra-processed food isn't food, it's an industrially produced edible substance. And this is to say, UPF is not actually food, it's just designed to look like it and to make it appealing to you so that you will ingest it. So when it comes to the harms of UPF, the book reads like a complete horror story. I put these into 3 different categories: lack of nutritional value, chronic and acute illnesses, and addictiveness. An early controlled study of the effects of UPF in the early 2010s showed that on average, people eating a UPF-centric diet ate 500 calories extra per day than those who ate a non-UPF diet. And while it's true that a lot of UPF foods like chocolate and sweets will have low nutritional value and inspire us to eat more, there's actually more to it than that. Further studies in the book highlight that it's not just the low nutritional quality of the food that harms us, but it's actually the act of the processing of the food itself. Which means that the processing and manipulation of the ingredients, such as bleaching and deodorizing oils like palm oil and adding emulsifiers and sweeteners to our bread, cause harm in and of itself. Thought of another way, if a homemade non-UPF pizza made from 4 ingredients from a supermarket, so like flour, oil, salt and water, is compared with a supermarket frozen pizza with 15 different ingredients, and they all have the same nutritional value in terms of calories and macros, there is something about the ultra-processed nature of the supermarket pizza that makes it inherently less healthy. This is extremely important because it shows that UPF food is not just nutrient poor, it's inherently bad for us in and of itself. When we look at chronic and acute illnesses, there's a myriad of evidence that UPF has a strong negative effect on our health. Poor diet has long been linked with a rise in obesity, but as the book points out, the epidemic levels of obesity we now have in the Western world can be linked to the steady increase in UPF over the last few decades. And more than this, one study of 100,000 people in the British Medical Journal found that a 10% increase of UPF in the diet resulted in a proportional 10% increase in the risk of a variety of cancers. Another study of 92,000 Americans found that an increase in UPF in the diet led to an increase in cardiovascular disease, even when controlling for things like fat, salt, and sugar, which is to say that it was inherently the ultra-processing that increased disease, not the higher fat content of what they ate at all. The book is littered with a variety of studies that show how UPF is linked to everything from increased obesity to depression and dementia, and I would highly recommend reading the book to get a deeper understanding of just how much UPF can contribute to ill health. Another aspect worth learning about is the addictive properties of UPF foods. This is something that particularly resonates with me. Over the last couple of years, I've tried to make better decisions about the foods that I consume. I tried to drink a little less, I got a personal trainer, I tried to cook healthy meals and count calories, etc. But one thing that I found very hard to shake is my sweet tooth. I can make the healthiest dinner in the world and then an hour later get a craving to eat 4 chocolate bars and undo all the good work I had done at my healthy meals. The author goes into some nice detail about why we think UPF is addictive. First of all, we need to reframe what UPF is. It's difficult to think of food as addictive because food is a life-giving substance. Our bodies require it for energy to survive. But is UPF really food? Several scientists the author spoke to think that it's not, with one calling UPF an industrial produced edible substance, like I mentioned earlier. If you think of UPF this way, not as a food, but as something formulated to look like a food, then it's easier to understand how it could be an addictive substance. Food isn't addictive, UPF is. But why is this? There are 2 ways that I want to look at this. Firstly, UPF disrupts the hormones that regulate our appetite and our hunger. So when we eat UPF, we are less full and more hungry, which leads us to have desire to consume more. And secondly, the author compares UPF to drugs of abuse. He says that both are modified from their natural states so that there is a rapid delivery of a rewarding substance. In UPF, that rewarding substance is often sugar or artificial sweeteners. And like drugs, people report similar addiction symptoms with UPF and other addictive substances, including craving, repeated unsuccessful attempts to cut down, and continued use despite negative consequences. The author can personally vouch for this from his own experiences eating UPF, and to be honest, so can I. I can regularly feel restless or stressed from craving something like a chocolate bar or sweets. Next, I want to look at the history of UPF and how the industry promotes it. The history of UPF can be traced back to the late 1800s when a chemist called Constantin Fahlberg created saccharin, the first artificial sweetener and the first completely synthetic chemical to be added to our food. This was a watershed moment in human history and it's still used today in artificial sweeteners. Synthetic foods then took a turn for the more sinister during World War II when the Nazi government, suffering from severe fat shortages among the troops and wider population due to rationing, contracted a corporation to develop a synthetic butter from the byproduct of a process involving coal. Coal butter, as it was known, was approved for use among Nazi troops despite reservations about its safety for human consumption, including some data that showed it caused chronic indigestion and kidney issues. As the author points out, coal butter shows us not only the danger of ingesting synthetic compounds that we aren't evolutionarily designed to eat, but also the dangers of corporations and government in putting profit far ahead of human safety. Today, we see this on a far more industrial scale. Many of the ingredients in UPF products are either partly or entirely synthetic, such as artificial colours and sweeteners. And throughout the book, the author goes to lengths to highlight how the industry is highly unregulated and how it develops and markets its foods. In the US, for example, regulation is almost non-existent. A loophole in the law allows food companies to decide what is and what isn't safe to put in their food, completely bypassing FDA oversight. Effectively, they self-regulate and can add whatever substances they want to their foods, which in essence will mean that they'll add the cheapest and most efficient, regardless of the long-term health effects. The situation in Europe is somewhat better, but it's still far from perfect. Cheaper processing means cheaper products, and it is true that UPF is far cheaper than less processed foods. In a study highlighted in the book that tested UPF and non-UPF diets in a controlled environment, feeding the non-UPF participants cost 1/3 less than the ones eating UPF. Because of the cheapness of UPF, it is easily marketed to low-income and poor individuals and families. In a world where lower income generally means poor health, UPF is exacerbating this problem, particularly in developing countries. The author highlights a story involving Nestle, the world's largest UPF producer, creating a floating shop on a barge and taking it upriver through the Amazon in Brazil and selling the products to people in the towns along the way. The result was a huge increase in chronic illness, including type 2 diabetes and obesity. Before the arrival of the Nestle floating shop, type 2 diabetes didn't even exist in this remote region, but the arrival of UPF created a variety of problems. In addition, aggressive marketing campaigns like this result in the destruction of traditional diets, such as the people of these Amazonian towns would have had before the addictive UPF foods infiltrated their communities. And you don't need to go as far as the Amazon to see the effects of this. The author refers to the city of Leicester in the UK as a food swamp. The city is rife with UPF both in terms of fast food outlets and supermarkets. Deprived areas have a higher density of fast food outlets, meaning that non-UPF food is both geographically and financially more difficult to attain. UPF is cheap, addictive, and stores easily, and for many poor people it's their only option, especially in a world where the preparation of real food requires more time, energy, and money. UPF companies know this, and they actively exploit impoverished communities in order to increase sales and profit. This was one of the most important realizations I had with this book, and one that has led me to stop thinking of food companies as providers of food and more like drug pushers. So let's look at some of the solutions the author talks about. One of my favorite aspects about this book is what it doesn't do. It doesn't preach, it's not a dieting book, and it's not a self-help book. There's no section on how to stop eating UPF and what you should eat instead, or how to live a healthier lifestyle. This might appear frustrating at first, especially after reading 300 pages about the horrors we're inflicting upon ourselves, but it's by design. Rather than giving us useless prescriptions like don't drink Diet Coke, drink water instead, Tulleken instead wants us to gain a holistic understanding of what's going on, which is to say that UPF companies are designed to exploit you. They're designed to make their foods addictive, and they're designed to extract maximum profit from you. There's two important takeaways from that knowledge, in my opinion. Firstly, it's important to understand that it's not your fault if you eat a lot of UPF. These multi-billion-dollar companies spend astronomical figures on advertising to entice you to ingest their products. We're all victims of these companies. And secondly, it's that a cultural shift is required to take place if we are to limit the UPF that we eat. Tulleken argues that if any change is to come in terms of how much UPF we consume, it needs to come through legislation. But legislation won't come until there has been a cultural shift among the public in how we view UPF. Too many people still have favourable views of companies like Coca-Cola and Nestle, when the reality is that we should be looking at them like cigarette manufacturers. So if there's one solution to the UPF problem that I have taken away from this book, it's to inform yourself first and then to inform others. Seismic change is needed in how we regulate the food industry, and that change won't happen unless there's a demand for it. That brings us to the end of the video. If you found it enjoyable and you found it informative, feel free to hit the like button and subscribe for more deep dives into non-fiction books like this in the future. Bye for now.